Hello there, my name is Justin Sayers. This is the Brussels Signal studio, and we're very happy to have Michael Hogeveen here, an MEP from the Netherlands. Thank you once again for coming to see us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
It's January the 31st, and we're heading towards the European elections. But before we get on to the big EU themes of today, could I just ask just 1 minute quickly on you, please? I notice you have a financial background. What made you want to become a politician?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. My name is Michael Hogeveen, a Dutch MEP, and originally a political scientist, actually. And when I finished my political degree, I started doing some freelance work, doing some geopolitical analysis, mainly in the Northeast Asia region, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and the nuclear issues that we have in that region. But unfortunately, that wasn't necessarily paying the bills. So I also have a background in business. So I started working in business, in consulting. And when I worked at a very large consulting firm, I saw what was happening to our small and medium-sized businesses when new rules, EU rules and regulation would come down on the member states, would be imposed on the member states, and I saw the effect it had on our great companies that just want to be an entrepreneur. And I saw that every time a new EU legislation was introduced, the company I worked with, they were able to set up a new department in order to send new consultants to companies.
The consultants profit, but the businesses pay.
Exactly.
Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And for me, that was I was already somewhat involved in politics, but that was with the big government party, and they were just not delivering on their promises. So I turned my back on that party, and then a new political party came up, and I got involved, and well, here I am.
And here you are, and this is the JA 21, the JA 21 party.
Yes.
How would you describe it? Is it fair to say that it's a conservative party, for example?
Well, officially we are known as, we are registered as a party called Conservative Liberals. So culturally more conservative, but economically more liberal. So pro-free markets, small government, and pro-business.
Okay, and here in Brussels, in the European Parliament, you sit in the ECR group. Is that a comfortable position for you?
That's exactly the group we belong.
The European Conservatives and Reformists.
Yes, because in the European Parliament, if you are a member of the more of the mainstream groups, you really have to align with the majority of the group. And with the European Conservatives and Reformist group, you have some sort of a red line on where to vote, on how to vote, but overall, you're free to vote in favor of your own national interests.
Okay.
And that's what we believe that the EU should be all about.
Okay, now let's move on to the Netherlands. Obviously, we've had these elections which have thrown up the character of Mr. Wilders, and negotiations are ongoing in the Netherlands on the formation of a government. What's your understanding as to where we are today, and what's your opinion of Mr. Wilders?
Well, I think Mr. Wilders has saw a great rise in popularity since the last elections. He toned down a bit of his rhetoric. He was very stern on anti-Islam. He wanted to close down mosques, forbid the Quran, and he more or less put aside these issues, and he started focusing on the issues that matter for the people. Again, for the middle class, the tackling migration, tackling the housing crisis. So that's why he became quite successful. On the other hand, he also campaigned very much on a bigger government, a bigger welfare state, very populist in that sense. Free healthcare for everyone, for example. But he became the biggest, so he's now leading the talks for a new coalition, for a new government. But it's difficult because there are parties who are more or less aligned, who are in the talks now on migration, for example. All the parties want to tackle migration, but don't know what to do, for example, with government finance, with taxes, with austerity measures. And I think these are the most difficult parts of the talks, because it's about how do you allocate resources, and inevitably you also have to disappoint people. And as we're seeing now in the debates in the Dutch Parliament, is that for Mr. Wilders, who has always been in opposition, who has always said, when I'm in charge, I get things done, but now he finds out that it's actually not that easy. So,
but do you think he should be given a chance in power?
Obviously.
Right.
The Dutch people have spoken. He has become the biggest party. He is now in the polls on 1/3
Right.
of the seats. So people really want to have some form of change and want to give him a chance.
Okay.
So I say, when the people want Prime Minister Geert, give the people Prime Minister Geert.
Okay.
Let him try. And if he fails, he fails.
He's also been very critical of the European Union in the past, and this leads on to my next question, which is Nexit. And if I'm not mistaken, you've made some comments on this subject as well in the past. But, well, I mean, Mr. Wilders has also tamed his own rhetoric. You're not in favour of Nexit. You're one of these politicians who believe the EU should be reformed from the inside. Is that fair?
Well, Mr. Wilders has always been in favor of a hard Nexit, so out of the single market, and we believe as Ja21 that's not very favorable for the Dutch economy. We have Schiphol Airport, we have the Port of Rotterdam. We are basically the hub for continental Europe. So we're in a very different position than the United Kingdom, for example. What we do believe is that the EU was founded with the principle that free trade, forming a free trade area, creates prosperity, it creates peace, it creates stability. So it was about removing trade barriers. And at some point, the EU started not only becoming about removing barriers, but also by the concentration of power, by not removing trade barriers, but setting standardization. And I think that's a very different union. I think that was since the Maastricht Treaty that the union has changed into a very different direction and has gained control over many areas of policies that we believe the EU should have nothing to say about. So we believe that we want to go to the people. We should tell this story. We should tell this narrative. We should counter the argument of this ever closer union, bigger EU, which is now inevitably the direction we're heading in. But we should create an opposition that really wants to have a different direction of the European Union.
So that means reform from within.
Yes, and I think it's possible.
And that's starting with the European Parliament in the elections of this June, right?
Exactly.
Okay, yes. Okay. Now, I mean, you've talked about the centralization of power here in Brussels, and there are big pieces of legislation going through at the moment. Perhaps we can just touch on one of them, and that's the Green Deal. I know that. Well, what do you think? I'll leave it open. Well, I mean, are there elements in the Green Deal that you approve of, and do you disapprove? And if so, which ones?
Well, first of all, I think we believe that climate change is real, and it's we see that obviously if we look at the consensus from researchers. And also that humans are accelerating this effect. So that's a given. Then you have to ask yourself the question, what is an effective policy? And the European Union, with its Green Deal, has said, well, we now monopolized the opinion on climate change. Science says this, but our policies are also as given as the science. But that's not a given. The effect of the Green Deal on our economy is a disaster. If you have these very arbitrary net zero goals, you create nothing more than a planned economy. If you really want to tackle climate change, which is always seen as a so-called global problem, you would never exclude nuclear energy from your energy mix, for example. You would always encourage innovation, not government subsidies and tax breaks. So we believe that this whole Green Deal should be off the table. It's a disaster for our economy. It creates a sort of green planned economy that's centralized at the European Union and imposed on the member states. It strangles our economy. What we believe is that we should move towards a more market-driven approach that encourages innovation, that encourages renewable energies, but in a direction that is common sense, and that's something that we really miss.
Well, how can that be done?
Well, first of all, we should include nuclear energy. We should invest in nuclear energy. We should invest in nuclear research. Secondly, we should keep natural gas included in our energy mix. Natural gas emits half of the CO2 compared to, for example, coal, which is now used in Germany because they got rid of their nuclear power plants and started focusing on these renewables, solar and wind, which is never enough for your energy mix. So include natural gas.
Encourage it, you mean? I mean, it is included already, isn't it? We're importing natural gas, LNG, into Europe.
We're importing LNG also.
Yeah.
So it's included now, but that's only because of the war Russia had started in Ukraine. So, but it's only seen as a temporary solution.
Okay.
But we believe it should be included first and foremost within the taxonomy. And now it's still very much of a gray area.
Right. You mentioned taxonomy. For those who
yes.
Excuse me, for those who don't understand, you're saying it should be encouraged fiscally via the tax system.
Yes.
Right.
Which again is this notion from the European Union. This taxonomy is putting arbitrary labels on products and energy products, for example, on this is brown, this is green, and when it's green, it should be included for subsidies and tax breaks, which again creates a form of a planned economy.
Right, okay, okay.
So we believe, in short,
so nuclear power, gas, natural gas,
yes.
Go on.
Well, if you would truly want to do something about tackling the emission of CO2, you can use market principles to steer and guide the market towards a more cleaner economy, so to say.
Isn't that the emissions trading system?
Well, you can do that. That's something we could contemplate on. But then again, it should be market driven. And what we see now is that we have, for example, an emission trading scheme, but we also have huge amounts of subsidies, tax breaks, taxpayers' money basically subsidizing industries that might not be viable. So if you put a price on CO2, it should be done in a free market, because then you, with market principles, automatically steer and guide companies towards investing more in innovation, R&D, etc.
Okay, well, we could talk 30 minutes about that subject, but we haven't got the time. Let's go on. Given that you have a financial background, I wanted to talk about, and that you know about North Korea, I wanted to talk about sanctions. There's a heavy sanctions regime in place now, focused on, well, a number of countries, but I mean, Russia is the one everyone's talking about, and there have been, how many packages are we on now? 13 packages of legislation. Do sanctions work? Are they working? Let's take Russia or North Korea.
Well, as an academic, so as a political scientist, I think sanctions are the worst foreign policy tool you can have.
Why?
Because they isolate a regime. They tend to change the behavior of an autocratic or dictatorial regime to the way we see fit. But the opposite happens. If you look at North Korea, it's the most sanctioned country on earth, but it still manages to survive. And while it's surviving, it's more and more disconnected from the global economy. It's more and more isolating its people. And it gives the regime an opportunity to go to its people and say, look, you're not impoverished because of our communist, socialist, terrible economic policies. You are impoverished because of U.S. imperialism.
The bad guys, right.
The bad guys.
Right.
So we are also creating with the people inside these countries our own enemies.
Right.
And so I think that in terms of foreign policy, I think sanctions are ineffective, and they actually achieve the
backfire, right?
They backfire. Then again, I must say it's also a moral argument. if you, for example, the Russian Federation invades Ukraine, there should be consequences.
What are they then if they're not sanctions?
Well, I think it's always, if you could impose sanctions, you should have targeted sanctions on, for example, regime officials.
Okay.
They won't be of any substantial effect, but again, it's a moral argument.
Okay.
At least you have the signal towards the regime. You send a signal, we do not accept this, that you have these kinds of behavior.
Okay.
But the fact we are no longer exporting, I don't know, butter to the Russian Federation,
Right.
that doesn't really hurt the regime.
No.
It hurts our companies,
Okay.
and it hurts the people over there.
But what's the alternative sanctions then? I mean, we can ban a few politicians from visiting the EU, but what else can we do in Russia's case?
Well, I don't think there's a lot we can do.
Okay.
Actually. I think that, we can support Ukraine, which we are doing economically, militarily. We are all for that. But then again, there's also a point in time where you have to face reality in geopolitics, that there is just nothing that you can do. The world is not a place that you can create according to your liking. Sometimes there are certain situations in certain areas of the world where you can just say, well, okay, we support the country that has been a victim, that has been invaded. But at some point, we are politicians elected. For example, me, I'm a politician elected by the Dutch people. I represent the Dutch citizens. I'm not some sort of global engineer that can fix all the issues in the world.
Politicians should accept their powerlessness in this case.
Well, we should accept the limits.
The limits of their power. Okay,
Exactly.
but you said you're in favor of supporting Ukraine both economically and militarily.
Yes, I think that's
Okay.
I think that's in our interest.
Without limit, or are you in favor of a ceasefire and negotiations with the Putin regime?
I think coming up with terms without limits, endlessly, as long as necessary, I think this is just politicians being all tough. There's always a point in time. Again, I studied the Korean War, for example, which was an endless, bloody war. They went from the south, they went back to the north, millions of deaths. And at some point, both parties said, okay, this is no longer...
Let's talk.
Let's talk. Let's have an armistice agreement, and which still holds up today.
Has that moment come in Ukraine?
We don't know yet. We don't know yet.
Okay. Let's move on. Digital euro.
Yes.
I know that this is one of the subjects you've worked on. In fact, weren't you the shadow rapporteur for one of these reports in the European Parliament?
Yes.
Okay. Good idea, bad idea. You're going to say bad idea, aren't you?
It's a very bad idea.
Why?
It's a solution looking for a problem.
What does that mean?
It's when we look at the payments industry, that's an ancient technology. If I send some money from my bank account to your bank account, you have a British bank or a Belgian bank.
I can't say.
At least it's from another country than the Netherlands. It takes 2 to 3 business days. That's based on a system in the 1980s. But that has already been fixed. I've been the rapporteur on the instant payments regulation, where within the common market, within 10 seconds, you would have your money on your bank account, on your foreign bank account. Now, the European Central Bank comes out and they say, well, this payment system is still not good enough.
Right.
We should have our own currency, which again serves what purpose? Why do we need a digital euro? If I would go in the street and I would ask a person, would you like to have a digital euro? I think everybody would say, a digital what? I already have my bank cards.
Right.
I already have.
There's no need for it.
There is no need.
So why are they pushing it then?
Well, I think they're pushing it because they. I always call that. In the past, you had this photography company called Kodak. They made these old.
I remember
old cameras, and then the digital camera came up, and they missed
the transition.
They missed the transition.
Okay.
So what the European Central Bank says, we're losing the battle on cash because cash is less and less used, and if we lose our monetary anchor, so to say, because the central bank prints cash. They print the money, but the money in your commercial bank is not printed by the European Central Bank. That's actually created by the commercial banks.
Right.
So what they say is, if the uses of cash decreases, then we have no power left.
Okay.
So we need a digital form of cash. So it's basically their Kodak moment, so to say.
It's all about power,
It's
basically.
all about power. It's all about being relevant, staying relevant.
And what about these privacy concerns? Are they real? Do you share them?
In theory, yes, as we are seeing in the People's Republic of China, for example. We see this digital yuan, where it is in theory possible, and which was also a Chinese director from the International Monetary Fund, also said, well, the biggest advantage of this so-called central bank digital currency, which is what the digital euro is that it's programmable. So, for example, during the COVID crisis, you could well, we all got some amount of money from the government in order to stay afloat. Subsidies. But then the government can say, well, okay, we give you these kinds of government benefits, but you can only use it to buy food, for example. Or
so it's about you can control people.
You can control people. Now, in the European Union, this is not really the case. It's actually written in law that this is not allowed. This should not be allowed, should never be allowed. So in that sense, I don't really think it's a problem in the European Union. Then again, there's always something called mission creep.
Right, they could change the law.
They could change the law. So that is also something I think involves quite some risks. And the last argument why we should be against the digital euro is because it also has a risk of creating problems in the financial system. If the ECB is now presenting the digital euro as the most safe form of money. So what do they mean? Well, if you put your euros in a digital euro account, it's directly stored at the central bank. So they say it's super safe because the central bank cannot go bankrupt. So you're basically saying that the money in your traditional bank account is not safe. So what will happen when they introduce the digital euro?
Everyone will move.
You'll have a digital bank run, which is something that can actually disrupt the financial system. It involves huge risks. Don't do it.
Okay, that's very clear. Let's talk about free speech. I remember you from the Brussels Signal launch event. You asked a question. We were talking a lot about free speech, and you asked a question on media publications and how is it possible to regulate and at the same time preserve free speech while maybe cracking down on some of the, well, on illegal activity online. What conclusion have you come to? Is the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, are these tools relevant? Do you trust the European Commission and Mr. Commissioner Breton?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most crucial debates in our time. We see the rise of social media and we see the effect it has on democracy. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying that we can now voice opinions that were back in the day not heard. So I think we can now express more freely, we can be more vocal, we can have a better and stronger debate than ever before. But it also comes with downsides, and that's something I see within the European Parliament since I've entered into politics, is that, look, I'm very critical on the European Union. I'm very critical on mainstream politicians, and I try to be as vocal as I can. But I also try to be a politician that comes to Brussels in order to create law, in order to have a constructive debate on what I think serves the best interest of the Dutch citizens. But social media encourages behavior that is more extreme, and in order to generate retweets, clicks, likes, whatnot. And I think that also has its effect on how politicians operate in, for example, the European Parliament. They no longer come to the European Parliament in order to create law, to make law, but to make noise, because they become some sort of quasi-influencers.
Right.
And I think that's detrimental to our to the functioning of our democracy.
Okay.
Because if there are no longer politicians serious about reaching across the aisle, making compromise, making good governance, that serves the
Okay,
interest of
I
our
mean,
people.
I think lots of people would agree with you, but the reality is we have social media, and so
Exactly.
we can't turn it off and
No.
go back.
Yeah.
So what are we going to do?
Well, I don't really know where this is going. I don't really have an answer for it. I think that the way we're now censoring people is definitely not the solution. That we have some Ministry of Truth coming up with so-called fact checkers, which are always politically polarizing, so to say. They always have some form of bias and political thought in the back of their mind when they come up with certain fact checking. And sometimes when fact checking is done, in hindsight, sometimes
The story was right.
the story was right at all. So I think, but I must be honest here. I don't really have a clear and cut answer for it. I
Right.
think it's a dilemma. I think it's something we will find out in the future where we find the right balance. But I do think there are some dysfunctional consequences from social media. But I don't really think it's also the solution in order to have more government control by imposing certain opinions and facts on the people.
Okay, so just to make sure I understand that right, you're saying there are problems with social media, but government isn't the answer. Is that what you're saying?
No, and I think the only answer where I would draw the line is that you have illegal content.
Right.
That should obviously be removed. If we look at these very nasty things that are on the internet, which are already banned from the internet in the first place.
You're talking about terrorism, apology for terrorism, for example, or child pornography.
like that.
Right, yeah.
And I think that should be very clear.
Right.
But where to draw the line on,
Right.
for example, what is a conspiracy theory?
What is
What's
disinformation?
What's disinformation?
Right.
What's just some wacky person saying wacky things?
Right.
I mean, I can still, stand in the city square and come up with the most crackpot theories and just be very vocal about it. Nobody would remove me from the city square.
Well, you never know. It might happen at some
It might happen,
point.
it
Yeah.
might happen.
Yeah.
And again, most people would just think, well, this is a loony.
Right.
But I have the right to be a loony.
Right.
But apparently, if we talk about social media and the digital environment, it's different to be a loony because it might be more dangerous. But then again, what's the difference between the digital environment and the city square?
I guess it right.
So
it expands your reach, doesn't it? That's the main difference.
Yes, I
guess.
think so. But
Right.
then again, I think with the rise of the printing press, with the rise of radio and television, I think we had the same problems, and I think we find more or less organically a solution.
Okay.
So I think, I trust in the power of society to come up, in democracy, to come up with our own solution. But what the solution is, I just don't have the answer.
Okay. We're heading towards 30 minutes, but I want to ask you a bit more about the elections and the things that are happening here in Brussels. We have the European Parliament, for example. Some people think that there will be a larger right-wing group, if not necessarily a majority, more Eurosceptics in the Parliament. And if this happens, what will the effect be on the European Commission and the other institutions? I mean, what is your opinion, for example, of Charles Michel, who is the president of the European Council, and von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission? Have they done good jobs? Would you vote for Madame von der Leyen again? Did you vote for her last time or not?
I wasn't in Parliament.
Oh, yeah, it was before your time. Right, okay. Would you give her the thumbs up this time, do you think?
Well, first of all, there's lots of talks now in the Brussels bubble on the European Parliament getting a majority towards a more Eurosceptic right-wing majority. We still have to wait and see, because these polls are based on national polls, so how people would vote nationally, according to their national way of thinking. But when we go to the European elections, it's always very much of a different story. There is a lower turnout, and most of the people who come out and vote are already enthusiastic about the European Union anyway. So we, as more Euro-realist, Eurosceptic parties, we should really encourage our people to go out and vote, because every vote matters. If we can get a majority of center-right to right-wing parties, we could really change the narrative for the first time ever in the European Parliament towards a more national, sovereignist way of thinking and way of policy making. So that's a first.
Okay.
When we talk about actual policies coming from Brussels, I think we should also start to learn how to work together on the right, how to make deals together. So we have some political parties that are, more or less all the right-wing political parties have one common denominator, and that where they agree on, and that is to tackle migration. But how to tackle migration, that's a very different story. But the main issues we have to work together on is how do we tackle public finances? How do we tackle how do we limit government, or in this specific case, how do we limit the power of the European Union? That is something we should really discuss, because what I see, and then again I come back to Geert Wilders. He constantly votes in favor of more government, more welfare state, and I think that is when you are in this European Parliament, and sometimes I see that from the group which Geert Wilders is part from, they vote in favor of anti-trade, more big government policies. And I think that's a big problem. And I think that sometimes these decisions can be a bit painful first for people, because if you have smaller government, you have less welfare, less subsidies, less tax breaks. But in the long run, it's better for everyone. So I think we should compromise on that, and we should learn to compromise on that.
You're a small government guy, I get that, and you're a skeptic, I get that too. But what about my question on the people who represent Europe on the world stage now, Mr. Michel and Madame von der Leyen? What do you think of the jobs they've done?
I think they are a very interesting duo. First of all, let's take Charles Michel, President Michel. He is president of the European Council, so of the member states. So he represents the member states. I think he has the most important position in the European Union, but he has been, quite invincible, not very visible in the
invisible.
Invisible. And I wanted to say invincible, but
that's a different word.
That's not right. But he has been a very poor president of the European Council. He hasn't represented the member states at all. So that position was taken over by a very fanatic and ambitious Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission. Now, I think it should be the other way around. I think someone who represents the member states as the EU, as an intergovernmental institution, he should be more on the forefront, protecting the rights of the member states. And Ms. von der Leyen, she should be back in her bureaucratic office, because she's more or less the head of a secretariat. She has to make sure that the European Commission makes sure that the common market works well and nice, and we stick to the rules. That's it. But it's now the other way around. We see von der Leyen standing on stage in the United States, promising like a sort of Oprah Winfrey person, promising all kinds of aid to Ukraine and to poor people across the world, and that's not her role. She should be put back in her office. And I think that for the next mandate, if we are able to have a right-wing majority in the European Parliament, there should be some changes in office.
Okay, so changes, that means you would not support her for a second mandate?
Never.
Okay. That's great. I wanted to, we've done 30 minutes already. Can I just take you back to North Korea? Because I know you've done some research on this subject. I mean, with Hamas and Israel and Ukraine and Russia, maybe North Korea has been forgotten of late, but they are a nuclear power. Yeah. If you were a world leader, how would you deal with North Korea?
I think that North Korea has been a problem for a very long time, since the end of the Cold War. Most of the old Soviet countries more or less disappeared, and one or two countries remained in this Cold War style, and that's Cuba and North Korea. And North Korea managed to survive by also aspiring to become a nuclear power state. Everything they do is in favor, all their policies triumph for the regime to survive. Now, my theory has always been, and that has worked in the past, is that you get them out of their isolation. You try to make a deal because they want to become... The reason they have nuclear weapons is in order to defend themselves, in order to defend the regime. Just keep that in the fridge for a while and try to put the regime out of isolation. Try to give them economic incentives. They have shown in the past that they have been willing, in order to be integrated into the global economy and to have their economy grow, in order to have their middle class grow, in order to lower their defenses a bit, in order to lower tensions, ease tensions. And I think that happened under the previous administration from South Korea. They have done a very good job in the rapprochement with North Korea. And together with President Trump, I think that was a very good team, which ironically was a more progressive, liberal president in South Korea and a very conservative president in the United States. But that more or less, I think that worked. That was a policy that worked. What we see now, unfortunately, with everything happening in Ukraine, with everything happening with in Gaza, with Hamas, is that we are now rifting apart in the global economy. Also with the tensions rising with China, we're moving further and further away from each other. We're no longer talking to each other. And what we see now is that North Korea starts turning to Russia, for example. They provide Russia with arms. Russia provides the North Korean economy with coal, gas, whatnot, crude oil. So we're seeing this blockization of world politics. And what we believe is that we should break through this stalemate. We should start talking to each other again. And that can be very low-level diplomatic talks or track 2 diplomatic talks on how to foster trade again, how to create the right balance between, on the one hand, providing security, but on the other hand, also lowering our trade barriers and create a more level playing field. Because in the end, we all benefit from better relations,
so
better economic
engaging the regime is the answer, essentially.
We should not go back to a Cold War style way of having geopolitics, because that increases tensions and that increases the risk of a military confrontation that can spiral out of control.
And I presume you'd say the same about Iran.
I think Iran is a bit of a different story, because I think that if we talk about engaging with regimes, the red line, the line in the sand, is always when regimes operate, when the regimes start operating outside their own sovereign borders. And what we see with Iran is that this is an inherently expansionist regime with the Revolutionary Guard, with their involvement in Gaza. They are fighting their proxies with the goal of disrupting the region. So I think that if you were to engage with Iran, like, for example, the Obama administration did, they had the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, but that was a flawed deal to begin with, because if you want to create a more stable situation in the Middle East, you should also involve their biggest rival in the region, which is Saudi Arabia. And I think and Israel, obviously. And I think, again, if you start working on having these gradual talks, then maybe something you can work out. But if we look at Iran now, operating outside their own borders, I don't really think there's any incentive to talk to this.
So what you're saying is we will engage with you, but not at the moment, because you're funding these Hamas and proxies. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there should be some sort of preconditions before you have to.
No negotiations before you stop funding. Right, and because as a free trader, obviously you're very concerned about what's happening in the Red Sea, I presume.
Yes, obviously.
But I mean, couldn't we apply the same to Russia as well? There's obviously the Russian invasion. So you could say the same. No negotiations with Russia until Russia has pulled back to its pre-invasion borders.
Well, then what are the pre-invasion borders?
Which invasion?
Then it's a very different. It's a very difficult discussion. But I think at some point in time, which I mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, is that there should be some form of rapprochement, making a deal, having some gradual diplomatic talks, because you cannot have this endless situation of having this Cold War type of proxy war going on the outside borders of Europe without actually moving forward and try to ease tensions. At some point, there should be a way out, and
the question is when.
The question is when.
Right. Okay.
And I think that political leaders have the responsibility to also say to the people, we are always open to ease tensions, to have negotiations, not at all cost. We have some preconditions, but not come up with this rhetoric that we must win. It's either us or them. This kind of rhetoric is not helping, and I'm really afraid that at some point in time, some military escalation, which is always also the danger on the Korean Peninsula, for example, that some sort of unintentional military escalation and things will spiral out of control.
Are you talking about World War III? Do you think we're headed for World War III, Mr. Hoogeveen?
Well, I think that's always a very big statement. I don't know. Nobody knows. But what I can say for sure is that the military tensions and the rift we're seeing between, on the one hand, liberal Western democracies, and on the other hand, more authoritarian, so to say, regimes, and on the other side, the non-aligned countries, which are now also more forced to move towards these autocratic regimes. We're creating a world situation where there is more tension, there's more uncertainty, there's more fragmentation, there's more protectionism, so also in terms of trade, which I don't think benefits the people of our countries, but also not of the world.
Michael Hoogeveen, thank you very much for coming in. I appreciate your time.
Pleasure.